very easy to pick up. We've got a really big bouncy ball, it's a big racket, and it makes the game great for people who maybe have never played racket sports before.
I started playing Squash57 in uni. I found it had a really good social aspect to it, so it was an easy way to make friends in first year when no one knows anyone.
You can start from complete beginner and it's actually a very easy game to pick up. You're playing other people, so it's not like going to the gym where you're fighting yourself, but it's just really sociable and you have a giggle.
It's less severe on your joints, and because the ball's a little bouncier, it gives you an opportunity to play different levels and have a good game.
The kids were doing it, so I did it, so it was cross-generational. Get on court as a family.
Playing Squash57 has added to my fitness, can keep the rallies going a bit longer, gets me moving around the court. It definitely helps between squash and Squash57.
It's a really social side that I always wanted to get into, and I remember my coach said you should play, it'll really help with your squash, and it has done that, but more so it's just fun. You'll definitely catch the bug as soon as you start playing.
Join your local club and see if there are some group sessions, and there'll be a beginners group, and have a go.
So here we go. So first question, revenues. Do you think most of squash facilities would benefit from a more diverse revenue stream? Diversity. Would you like squash to be more inclusive, such as more women, individuals with a disability, etc.? So juniors, do you believe that fun is one of the main factors that encourages juniors to play a safe sport, or to play sport in general even? Capacity. Do you think there are any squash courts that may be at risk of being closed or repurposed? Doubles. Do you think there are squash players who would play doubles if they had the opportunity? So that's the end of our questions, and I think based off the responses, as everyone can see, there's an overwhelming interest in trying to find something new and creative to help squash come back from this pandemic. And the feeling of our panel today is that Squash 57 just might be the answer to help your squash clubs try something new. And so with that being said, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our lead presenter today, Dave Morrish, who will introduce himself and his presenters. And I am going to just switch my screen to today's presentation. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Squash Canada webinar on Squash 57. I'm Dave Morrish and have been blessed with a lifelong career in squash. I came to Canada 10 years ago, and it was in Windsor 5 years ago that I fell in love with Squash 57. We had a good 30 active players in our club before the pandemic hit. Squash 57 has most definitely prolonged my playing career. Unbelievably, there are over 80 of you here today from right across Canada and Barbados, Colombia, Costa Rica, USA, the UK. Thank you so much all for joining us today. You just got a brief taste of what Squash 57 is. Now let me introduce you to our speakers. Patrick Osborne is not only a very accomplished player in both squash, tennis and Squash 57, he is also probably the most knowledgeable person on the planet about Squash 57. He is chair of the WSF Squash 57 Commission, and he's also our guest of honour. Pete Goodings was one of the top UK Squash 57 players before coming to Canada 7 years ago. He still plays both squash and Squash 57 to a high level. He is also head pro as well as manager of the Gnorla Club in Edmonton. Lolly Gillen has very much been the glue. She brought us all together and the reason that we're all here today. She's a very passionate doubles player and has over 50 doubles titles to her name. She was president of Squash Canada for 5 years and is now Secretary General of the Pan American Squash Federation and a recent addition to the WSF Squash 57 Commission. Lastly, but most definitely not least, I'm delighted we have our very own President of Squash Canada, Steve Wren. Steve has played squash at the highest level, including winning a British Open. And though he's not yet tried Squash 57, he's well aware of its potential and impact. You'll see from the agenda that we've got quite a lot to get through today. So without further ado, we're going to get cracking and I am going to pass over to our guest of honour, Mr. Squash 57 himself, Patrick Osborne.
So thank you, Dave. My name is Patrick Osborne. I'm the chair of the World Squash Federation's Squash 57 Commission. So the WSF, this World Squash Federation, is the world body that oversees all disciplines of squash, including the softball and hardball games that you know, both singles and doubles formats, and Squash 57 as well, which again in singles and doubles formats. The Squash 57 Commission itself aims to protect the integrity and fairness of Squash 57 while raising the global awareness of the game. We focus on the rules, the equipment that we're using, so the equipment specifications, the coaching and officiating, while growing the inventory of our up-to-date online resources and a calendar of competitions. I would expect that prior to this webinar, you would have done a bit of homework and will know about Squash 57, at least to a minimal level. But just to err on the safe side, I'm going to quickly run through some slides that will ensure that we all have the same base level of understanding. So we can skip to the next slide. So this talks to the history of Squash 57. And as I'm saying, Squash 57 is a discipline of the game of squash. And the game of international softball squash, which I would imagine that we're all very familiar with, was born in 1830. And again, 80 years later, US racquetball began. So that's the sport that you'll also be probably familiar with. In 1976, so nearly 150 years after squash, a game called uk-racketball began. And this game became recognised by England's squash nearly 20 years later when the first England nationals took place. In 2016, given the potential confusion for a global sport called racquetball with a CK, it was rebranded by the WSF to Squash57. And this webinar, with your support, will be the catalyst that will kickstart a Squash57 explosion throughout Canada and will be an example for the rest of the world to see. So the court, both singles and doubles Squash57 are played on the same regulation international squash singles courts. And I've seen in some of the chat going on the side of the screen here that that's been noticed. Squash57 uses the exact same court markings, except that we don't use the service line on the front wall. So the faded line in the diagram is not used by Squash57, but otherwise all the lines are the same. For the racket, we use the same racket as American racquetball, which can be no more than 22 inches in length. And that is 5 inches shorter than a squash racket. And you might be able to see behind my right-hand shoulder here, 2 rackets hanging up. And that will show you the difference between the racquetball racket that we use for Squash57 and the squash racket. The more popular frames weigh between 150 and 180 grams. And the major brands that we see in the UK will be Caracal, Head, and Dunlop. This is quite a complicated slide, and it's talking to the Squash57 ball. So the Squash57 ball is 57 millimeters in diameter, and that's about 40% larger than the Squash 40 millimeter ball, which I have here in my hands, and is therefore about 2/3 heavier than the squash ball. All squash balls are known for their rebound resilience, i.e. how bouncy they are, and that is what this graphic is showing. It's showing the bounces of the balls. So the squash double yellow dot ball is about half as bouncy as the black Squash57 ball. And the Squash57 blue ball is about twice as bouncy as the squash single yellow dot ball. So that'll give you an idea of how bouncy these balls are. And for those of you who are familiar with American racquetball, the diagram also includes on the right-hand side an American racquetball. And you can see that is significantly even more bouncy than the Squash57 balls. There are about 10 manufacturers of these balls, the Squash57 balls, and they include Caracal, Price, Dunlop. The Squash57 balls may vary in quality and bounce consistency, so I would recommend that players use balls that are approved by the WSF, so they've gone through the rigorous testing process that we have in place. The rules are multiple pages long, but here are some base differences that are worth noting. So for the serve is hit off the bounce. So it's not hit as a volley, it's hit off a drop onto the floor. And as I said, the service line on the front wall is not used. So if the first service is a fault, then the receiver has the choice to stop play and request a second serve, or to play the fault itself. In doubles, the players strike the ball alternately, and so there's a continuous rotation of ball striker, and you would have seen that in the videos at the start of this webinar, where the striker of the ball then rotates to the back of the court to enable the next 3 players to play the ball before they strike the ball again. Scoring for doubles and singles is the same as squash, with a point to rally, par 11, and if tied at 10-all, then a player will win by 2 points, and matches will be best of 5. So Squash57 is a global sport and is played on squash courts. The WSF Squash57 Commission will be promoting Squash57 wherever there is a squash court today, which means every country on this map, which is in blue or green, is a target audience for Squash57. Squash 57 is a lifetime sport, and we see it as the fun-loving close cousin of squash.
Over to you, Pete.
I started playing some 12 years ago, and it proved to me that this game didn't negatively affect my squash. It actually enhanced it, and it also has the following benefits. It's easy to start for beginners, adults, and juniors alike. To pick a racket and start playing immediately is very, very easy, which is one of the big issues with squash. Inclusivity results in a diversity of players. We can get a lot more people playing, and the skill gap is a lot easier to marry up with people. For schools, it's easier for school programs to tap into Squash 57, and it gives us a better chance of getting more juniors on board and retaining those juniors. There's no additional court markings required, as it's played on the same court as single squash. And also, the equipment is relatively inexpensive, and it generally lasts a lot longer than a squash racket. Even though you have the same walls and things to deal with, they seem to be far more robust. So you don't actually have to fork out a lot of money for this equipment, and less often. It's great fun to play. I actually find I have more fun playing Squash 57 than I do squash a lot of the time. It's a very strategic game, and it bridges all the skill gaps. We often find that a lot of our club players who are better at squash can play far more fun and competitive games with lesser level players in their club, because it's the ball's harder to kill and the rallies go on for longer. So it encompasses a lot more people playing, and it gives you a lot more people to choose from the same playing pot. As we saw in the introduction video, we've got world champions like Nick Matthew and Peter Nicol having competitive doubles matches with club level players. That's a good indication of what it can do. It can generate a big pool of enthusiastic, fun-loving players from the ground up very quickly, and clubs will significantly notice an increased number of people coming through their doors because it's such a diverse sport, and it can increase in midweek off-peak court usage, as well as doubling the number of ladders and leagues. For events, Squash 57 events for all levels, from club player through to provincial and up to national competitions, have been experienced in England, and the growth in England was, before I came over to Canada 7 years ago, it was a booming sport. And as far as I'm aware, talking with Patrick, it's only gone on to bigger and better things. It's a very hard game to stop as well. The rallies are typically aerobic, strategic, and therefore easier on the joints. And I've certainly found it complements my squash perfectly. Being a close cousin of squash, it keeps the feelings of squash alive for those that have had to stop playing previously due to injury or feeling like they're just getting old. And that's not necessarily the main barrier, but is one of the things that stops people playing squash sometimes. Thus can give us a new lease of life and extend on-court time for people literally by decades. And also, there are several people who've come back to the squash court who've had game sort of stopping injuries, and Dave Morris is a test to that. He's had several knee operations, and he's now playing Squash 57 because his body allows him to. It teaches patience, resilience, rally building. The game of doubles is also fabulously entertaining and engaging. The sport as a whole can improve your footwork because the rallies are generally longer, and it further ingrains movement patterns as long as they're done correctly in the first place. There are way more benefits than we've listed, but this just gives you a flavour of what it can do for clubs, players, coaches, and our sport as a whole, and covers off most of all the questions from the slide that we showed earlier and the questions that were asked. So that's my part about Squash 57. So I'll hand back to Dave, and he can move you on.
Thanks, Pete. Very interesting. Yeah, I'll agree with him on that one. Squash 57 has most definitely prolonged my career. The only way I could describe it to you guys is, honestly, I feel like I'm playing the way I used to play squash 20 years ago, now with the racquetball, but it's a lot slower, so it's beautiful. Right, I'm going to hand over to Lolly now. What I would have said if I'd been online at the time was Lolly's very much been the glue of this. She's brought us all together, brought this team together, and done so much work on this. So Lolly, thank you for that. And I'm going to hand over to you. She's Secretary General of the Pan American Squash Federation. She's Squash Canada's international delegate and now a member of the WSF Squash 57 Commission. Over to you, Lolly.
Thank you, David, and I'm glad you made it. Before I start, I would like to briefly explain how I got hooked on Squash 57. 3 years ago, founder Eric Hart and I started Canada's first ever program teaching squash to individuals with mental, physical, and emotional disabilities. It's called the Canadian Inclusivity Squash Program. Since that time, I've been obsessed with trying to find easier ways to teach these kids how to play squash and how to make it more fun. Well, after meeting Patrick Osborne last year and learning more about Squash 57, I began getting very excited. But what better way to validate my thoughts than to reach out to my friend Peter Nicol, former world #1. And as you can see on the screen, this was his response to my email. I first want to say that I admire your relentless passion to bringing additional resources to those who are limited in some way, especially to children. By bringing Squash 57 to their lives, they will benefit greatly from physical exercise, which leads to friendship and overall well-being. It makes so much sense to promote this type of game, and I hope you are successful bringing it to Canada. Peter Nicol. Well, sadly, there's been now a deep global concern, including throughout Pan America, that up to 15% of squash courts around the world may not be able to reopen, or they may have to be repurposed as a result of COVID. We need to act now. We really do. Now, we all know that team sports have always been popular in Canada: football, hockey, soccer, baseball. But most recently, pickleball has exploded. Since its inception back in 1960 by a few American men following around a golf, in the last 2 years, pickleball has become the fastest growing sport in the world. Well, why? Because it's low impact way to get great exercise and it's fun. Recent statistics also claim pickleball doubles is the most popular version. Why? Because the rallies are longer, there's more social interaction, and because it demands lower physical effort. Yes, pickleball is yelling to the world loud and clear that the masses want to participate in a fun, sociable, easy on the body, and easy to learn sport. Well, as Pete has just told us, Squash 57 can offer all of this too. It's easy to pick up for beginners. It's not demanding on the body, and it's strategically addictive for the seasoned player. Plus, it's played on a 21 by 32 foot international squash court, which is approximately half the size of a pickleball court. We all know facility owners are always trying to find ways to increase revenue and to maximize court usage. More importantly, right now, there's going to be how to attract new members, how to get the existing members back on court, and then how to keep them all on court longer. By bringing Squash 57, every singles court in Canada instantly offers players 3 different versions of squash to play. And this juicy marketing carrot came with 0 capital investment. Now let's take a look at the impact of Squash 57 doubles would have on Canada. So here's a picture of the softball doubles courts in Canada. So softball doubles is the version that's played on the 27 by 32 foot court that you see in the Pan Am Games, Commonwealth Games, and World Doubles. But as you can see, there are only 3 clubs in Canada that have these courts. Okay, hardball doubles. Well, Canada boasts some of the best hardball doubles players in Pan America. It's extremely popular both competitively and recreationally, but there are only 37 clubs in Canada that offer hardball doubles. Okay, is everybody chewing their fingernails now? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Over 95% of the squash courts in Canada are singles courts. Now knowing that Squash 57 doubles is played on the exact same court as Squash 57 singles, which is played on the exact same court as international softball singles, over 1,000 courts in Canada, and that's not including hotels, private homes, non-member clubs. So think of it, can instantly offer every player a WSF sanctioned game of doubles, Squash 57 doubles. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, Squash 57 is a real game changer. The value proposition of a squash membership has more than doubled without the facility spending a dime. As we saw back on the slide in the questionnaire, 95% of you said that you would know or would like to try doubles. Embracing Squash 57 will not only help grow the sport of squash in Canada and Pan America, it's going to help make it more inclusive sport. It's going to make it more attractive to new and different audiences, and it's going to keep those who love to play on the court for many, many years to come. I sincerely hope everyone is as excited as I am to try Squash 57, and thank you so much for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Lolly. That was awesome. So just to put all this together now, we want to see where Canada stands, Squash Canada, and this is why we're delighted that we've got Steve Wren with us. So Steve, I'm going to pass over to you now to let us know what's happening with Squash Canada and this beautiful game of Squash 57.
G'day, Dave, and everyone out there. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be amongst this esteemed panel. I'm the guy who hasn't played this game, but I've heard a lot about it. And in my role as President of Squash Canada, I think we have a responsibility to explore what can be developed with this game within the confines of our own sport at the moment. What I'd like to talk about is where Squash 57 fits into the anticipation of our sport in the future, and how Squash Canada can assist this in the club's development and player participation. For instance, return to play strategy is something that we're being asked by our membership group, the provinces, territories across the country, to get heavily engaged with them in bringing members back to the clubs. Not only that, but bringing new people into the game as well. And it's been a long time since we've had that type of emphasis needed for our sport. We see Squash 57 as being one of those opportunities to be able to help us interest people with putting a racket in their hand in whatever format that it may be in order to play on our squash courts. I see this being a part of our ongoing communications with the PTs. We're entering into our next quadrennial for strategic planning, and Squash 57 has now wedged itself firmly into our considerations of what we need to do to be able to ensure that participation grows. How do I see it at club level? Well, diversification of a club's programs is obviously an interesting opportunity for members. I can see in a squash club how you've got your squash programming going on in one section and your Squash 57 taking place in another section, and they can speak to both types of members, both types of player. Doubles play, as you can see, facilities without doubles courts means a lot to us. That 4 people onto a court and court utilization starts increasing. We love that one. What about introduction for children, novices, adults, restricted mobility and unmobility, and of course inclusivity for the less fortunate, mentally, physically challenged, who we'd also love to see playing our game. And that's already started in pockets across the country, and thumbs up to those groups who have been able to achieve this. Squash 57 is now a new angle for them to approach, for those participants to have some success with ball on string. I also see, where do we fit Squash 57 in with our national championships? I get questioned this type of thing. Well, I don't want to make promises at this point, but there's certainly room for us to be able to present Squash 57 as a demonstration. And we know what that means, not necessarily a serious event, but certainly one which can promote what the activity looks like, feels like, sounds like, and talk to people who are actually playing it, give people an opportunity. I think of the legends of our game here in Canada. I mean, some of our best players who may come back to our nationals and grace the courts for us to be able to see them play. You can imagine, I'm going to drop a few names here, a Jean Turk and a Melanie Jans playing against Sam Cornette and Jonathan Power. I mean, that would be a delicious opportunity to see what happens with this game. So we'd love to see that type of thing take place, and look out for that one in the future. Anticipating Squash 57 into Squash Canada's mission, well, there's an awareness obviously now. We want to build on what we can provide to people who need more information. So equipment supplier relationships would be important to us, to those interested in the opportunity of which we don't have relationships with now. Educational resources, a part of our strategy with our PTs is to help out with resources. So we will be bringing information of this type of sport and game in a easy to reach manner through our website with a variety of different links for people to go to be able to see and read more about this and get ideas for your own programming. It's a bottoms-up growth approach. So this really speaks to the participation aspect, obviously. And as we continue in communications with our PT members, we'll follow along with their level of engagement and see how we can help as we learn more about this game within our own game of squash. That would be enough from me with what Squash Canada wishes to do. My dog, who's just come out from under my feet, now wants to leave the room. She obviously didn't like what I had to say, but I'll leave it with you. Thank you, Dave, and thank you to the panel, and thank you for all of your interest to join us here in Canada for this webinar.
Thanks, Steve. Jeff, could you put on the next slide? Yeah, so you'll see here that we put some online resources for you. Basically, there's so much stuff there for you to know more about this game. One thing that's not on there right now, but I want you to be aware of, is the three main players in England right now for the Squash 57 equipment is probably Caracal, Head, and Dunlop. And I believe we have representatives of all three here today. So they do have this equipment in stock, and you can get hold of them directly. You know, as Pete said earlier, it's not terribly expensive, you know, and the equipment does last a long, long time. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pass back to Patrick, who's got some closing remarks. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Dave. From a closing remarks standpoint, I wanted to say that Squash 57 has been around a while now. It's been around maybe 45 years, and it's played in 20 to 40 countries. And that's a little vague because sometimes these questionnaires are misinterpreted, but we see very active communities in 20 countries, and 40 countries claim that they play it at the moment. But now is really a very exciting time for Squash 57. As I say, it's been around for 45 years, but things are changing. With the pandemic, that's changed the outlook. And we have Zena Wooldridge now, who's the new president of the World Squash Federation, and she is a Squash 57 player. So there is an increased focus in the world of squash on Squash 57. They're looking at inclusivity. They want to look at fun. And that is really where Squash 57 hits the mark. Before the pandemic hit, England had shown what could be done with Squash 57. So 2019 was a real bumper year in England, and we're lining up for, even though it's going to be a late year this year, we're lining up for something similar this year. In England, nearly every squash club will have Squash 57 in their name in one way or another. There's a lot of quantifiable evidence that including Squash 57 will significantly increase your social court bookings with no effort, right? There's no court changes required. The lines are the same. There's no incremental cost for the club. And doing like analysis at the club that I play at, there is clear, unambiguous evidence that the increase in court bookings is about 30%. So that 30% of the court bookings are people who are playing Squash 57 only. They don't play a mix of Squash 57 and squash. These are people who are just playing Squash 57, and that has increased the court bookings by 30% alone. England has a fun, inclusive Squash 57 competition schedule or calendar, right from the club level all the way up to the nationals. We're playing Squash 57 singles and doubles. And in fact, this year, it was announced last week, we're going to have our nationals again in August, and we're going to have a British Open in October. So that's the first time we've had an open event. It was planned for last year, but couldn't take place. And in the nationals, we're planning to include wheelchair events as well. So that is something that will be new to what's going on in England Squash 57. This webinar has had a superb attendance. And if you look at the map here, we can see where or which Canadian cities are actually attending this webinar today. And there's clearly a huge opportunity here for Squash in Canada to launch Squash 57 across the whole of Canada, across the whole nation from coast to coast. And I assure you that the eyes of the squash world are certainly watching and are very excited by what's taking place here. So a huge thank you to Lolly on triggering all of this, and a huge thank you for Squash Canada and Dave for allowing us to participate in this webinar that was being arranged anyway. And I strongly encourage you to run with this golden opportunity. Say people will be watching, and I have a call later this week with Zena Wooldridge, as I say, who's the president, and the CEO as well, William. We're going to be talking Squash 57 the day after tomorrow off the back of this. So on behalf of the World Squash Federation and the Squash 57 Commission, we want to wish you the greatest success. And thank you very much for allowing us to speak with you today.
Thanks, Patrick. Jeff, I believe we've got some questions and answers now, aren't they? So I think you're going to take care of this, aren't you, and explain to people what they need to do and how they can get their questions over, correct?
Correct. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful presentation. And yeah, we've got some time for questions. So which ball do most people use, the black or the blue?
Okay, and that is a great question. So we have the two balls, the black and the blue, and the black is not as bouncy as the blue ball, and it's a personal preference. So they've been basically called less bouncy and more bouncy, and it's up to you which one you would like to use. Now, the one that is used the most will be the black ball. There are pockets of communities who like to use the blue ball, and an example of that will be Malaysia. So in Malaysia, which is a big Squash 57 playing community, they use the blue ball. And the reason they use the blue ball is because they wanted Squash 57 in their country to be as far removed from squash as they could make it. They obviously love squash, but they wanted a very different game. So they used the blue ball. But in the UK, I would say that 95% use the black ball.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. Next question, Patrick, if you want to answer this one as well, just some clarification around the Squash 57 ball. Is it the same diameter as a racquetball ball?
Yes, it is. It's the same diameter, but very, very different. So the bounce on a Australian racquetball ball is about the same as the blue ball. So it's quite lively. The American racquetball ball, and I know there are variations on that, and actually the IRF are trying to slow down their balls because to make the game more interesting to the audience, because the audience can't keep up with their regular balls, are much more lively than our blue ball. So it might look the same, but don't buy it for your squash court because it'll fly around like a super ball, and you'll regret it.
Great, thank you. Next question, this one probably best for Lolly, because I know you were talking to Kim at US Squash. Dennis Bishop asks, are the Americans playing Squash 57? Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit, Lolly, in your chat with Kim.
I think there's several coaches from the US on this webinar too that could answer better than I can, and also Patrick, because he's played events in the US, and as he said, in Albuquerque, so Albuquerque obviously has a contingency. Patrick, do you want to, I know Florida where Tim has some people playing. Pat, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, there are definitely pockets, and I think there is a Facebook group that is tracking which states are now playing or have active Squash 57 communities, and I think it's something like 20 states are now, there is now a contact point and Squash 57 activity taking place. So it's not mature there, but it's certainly picking up interest.
One other quick question just came in here. Bob Ballinger asks, for the average level of player, can a match be finished in 45 minutes with longer rallies involved? Patrick, I'm not sure if you want to take that one.
That's a brilliant question. So the club that I play at, we have 1 hour sessions, and we can fit it into 1 hour. For the competitions that get run, so the regional competitions in the UK, they will play best of 3, and because you're playing multiple times a day, yeah, best of 3, and you will get your game finished within the half an hour. So based on that, you know, if you're talking a 10-minute game, you may need 50 minutes if you're going to get 5 games, right? But it's a great question. But you know, on the flip side of that, you're going to spend less time walking around picking the ball up, right? You're getting your aerobic rallies, and you know, if you're 45 minutes, maybe you're hitting the ball for 30 of those,